The Bitterroot Mountains had already taken so much from Daniel. His career, his marriage, even his hope. But that winter morning, a desperate cry pulled him into the snow, where a trembling bobcat kitten lay half-buried, its tiny body refusing to give up. So Daniel wrapped it in his coat, carried it home, and named it Ash, never knowing that saving this fragile life would awaken his own will to keep going. Where are you watching from? Comment your city or country below, and if this moment touches your heart, like and subscribe for more true stories of love, courage, and second chances. Montana in deep winter isn't just cold, it's ancient, endless, unforgiving. The Bitterroot Mountains heaved beneath a sky so gray it seemed to press the pine forests flat. Every breath Daniel took stung his throat. Snow creaked under his boots as he followed a trail so old it barely left a mark. A path once used by Blackfeet hunters, now half swallowed by silence and white. It was supposed to be another solitary day. Walk for miles, breathe, let the world forget his name. But that morning, the forest felt tighter somehow, as if the world was holding its breath. Daniel paused beside an old cedar, brushing ice from his eyelashes, when a sound cracked the silence. A sharp, desperate cry, not bird nor wind. He froze, listened. The cry came again, weaker this time, winding up through the deadfall and brush like smoke. He stepped off the path, boots sinking deep, every sense sharpened. It was survival season in Montana. Anything alive and making that noise was either starving, dying, or about to be eaten. Still, he pushed through tangled limbs, the memory of his father's old words tugging at him. If you hear something suffering, you answer it, even if your own heart is tired. There, beneath a thicket of snow-splintered alder, he saw it. A bobcat kitten, maybe 12 weeks old, its spotted coat matted and crusted with ice, one paw curled awkwardly beneath its body. The kitten's ears flattened, eyes wild and unblinking, feral but burning with a stubborn will to live. He crouched, holding out his gloved hand. "Hey there, buddy. You're a long way from home, aren't you?" His voice was low, the same voice he once used on frightened wolves and orphaned moose calves. The bobcat didn't flinch. It just watched him, a tiny engine of fear and hope tangled together. Daniel's pulse hammered. He knew the rules. You don't interfere. Nature was cruel and the wild sorted itself on. But something about this creature, its size, its silent challenge, made the rules feel hollow. He slipped off his coat, bundled the kitten carefully inside, feeling its tremors pulse through the fabric. Its breath was ragged, but it didn't fight. That silence unnerved him more than hissing or claws. The walk home was slower, heavier. Montana's wind battered his face, flinging icy grit into his eyes, but he hardly noticed. His old log cabin, nestled near the Flathead River, its roof frosted white, waited ahead like a lifeline. He hurried inside, stoked the fire, and placed the bundle gently near the warmth. Under the flicker of lamplight, he checked the wounds. A deep gash along the foreleg, likely from barbed wire or a trap. Old anger burned in his chest. He'd seen enough careless traps in these woods to hate them. He cleaned the wound, hands steady, mind whirring. The kitten shivered but made no sound, watching him with raw, unblinking trust. Daniel whispered, "You made it through hell, little one. You don't give up, do you?" He needed a name. Ash, he thought. Born from ashes, carrying warmth even when the world had gone cold. That night, Daniel sat by the fire, the tiny form pressed against an old wool blanket, both of them exiles in a world that rarely showed mercy. In the hush, he felt it, a thread, thin but unbreakable, stitching him to this fragile life. It wasn't just a rescue. It was the start of something neither of them could yet name. If you've ever stumbled into a moment that changed your path forever, tell me, what did it feel like? Did you recognize it? Or did you only understand when you looked back? Like this story so far. Share your thoughts below and stick with me. This is only the beginning. Nights in Montana stretch long and heavy, as if time itself gets tangled in the pines. Daniel Harris lay awake on his old mattress, the fire in his wood stove reduced to quiet embers. Outside, the wind howled down from the Bitterroot Peaks, rattling the windows and reminding him just how small a man could feel in a place this wild. The Bobcat Kitten, Ash, slept fitfully on a folded blanket, paws twitching with dreams Daniel could never reach. For the first time in years, Daniel felt a pulse of responsibility, sharper than the ache that usually gnawed at him after midnight. But as dawn broke and the cabin filled with the thin, gray light of Montana winter, his mind couldn't help wandering backward, back to a life he'd once believed was destined for greatness. He'd been Daniel Harris, age 42, wildlife researcher with a reputation that stretched from Yellowstone to the Canadian Rockies. Years ago, they'd called him a rising star, a scientist with a knack for spotting hidden trails, a way of reading animal sign like a second language. His notes were quoted at conferences, his research funded by the best. Back then, every phone call felt like the next big opportunity. But that was before Yellowstone, before the failed project. He remembered the endless meetings, the pressure to deliver results that would please donors and politicians alike. There had been a plan, a grand one, ambitious enough to restore native lynx populations, revive lost streams, turn barren land into a haven for life again. But the weather turned, money dried up, and Daniel made a call that cost everything. A late-season storm stranded the reintroduced animals. The losses were public, humiliating. News articles ran with the word failure in the headline. His team scattered, his funding gone. In a matter of weeks, Daniel was no longer a star. He was a cautionary tale. His marriage, already worn thin from long absences and endless field seasons, snapped under the weight. Lisa packed her bags one cold morning and drove away, their shared dreams dissolving with the frost on her windshield. They hadn't spoken in years. There were days in Bozeman, right after, when Daniel barely left his rented room. The hum of traffic and the smell of takeout made him feel even further from the world he loved. In the end, it was the mountains that called him home. He came back to Montana, to the old log cabin at the edge of the Flathead River, his childhood home. Here, memories lingered. Fishing trips with his father at Flathead Lake, the county fairs in Missoula with funnel cake and fiddle music, his mother's voice calling him inside as dusk settled over the pines. But nostalgia was a poor companion. The land was beautiful, yes, but it couldn't answer the ache of feeling unneeded. His neighbors waved politely, but kept their distance. People in small Montana towns remember everything, especially disgrace. Daniel became the hermit at the end of the lane, the guy who bought supplies in Kalispell and never lingered for small talk at the gas station. He settled into exile. Days blurred into each other, chopping wood, patching the leaky roof, watching the Flathead's icy current drag driftwood past. He avoided the radio, ignored the stack of unopened mail. The woods became his only confidant, and he let himself believe he no longer mattered. But that night, watching the tiny bobcat's chest rise and fall with each breath, something in Daniel's heart flickered, almost unwillingly. Ash was fragile, battered by life but not beaten. It reminded him of the feeling he'd lost, the stubborn will to keep going, even when the odds said otherwise. In the hush, Daniel found himself whispering to the dark, "Maybe it's not too late to matter, even just for one small life." He stroked the kitten's fur, careful not to wake him. In that silent cabin, cut off from the rest of the world, Daniel realized he'd been wrong about exile. Sometimes, what looks like an ending is only a clearing, a place where something new might finally take root. Have you ever felt lost, as if the world had forgotten your name? What pulled you back? Was it a person, a place, or a moment that reminded you who you are? Drop a comment below, and let's talk about second chances. Daniel awoke to the sound of coughing, wet, desperate, not his own. He sat up, blinking sleep from his eyes, and saw the bobcat kitten sprawled at the edge of the blanket, sides heaving, a glistening thread of saliva dangling from its mouth. Outside, wind howled through the bitterroot pines, rattling the shutters with a force that promised another snowstorm by nightfall. He knelt beside Ash, his hands unsteady. The kitten's wound had reopened in the night, darkening the wool beneath him. "Not today, little guy," Daniel muttered. "You don't get to quit on me." It was instinct to reach for his old sat phone, a battered thing, still holding the number for the Bozeman Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. The woman on the line, Dr. Lindstrom, sounded skeptical from the moment Daniel explained the situation. "You've got a wild bobcat kitten? Alone? Injured?" Her tone was the mixture of curiosity and warning he'd heard too many times as a field researcher. "We've taken in moose calves and eagles before," she said. "But bobcats are different. High mortality. They rarely survive this young without their mother." Daniel's voice was raw, stubborn. "I'm not asking for miracles. Just guidance. Supplies, if you can spare them." He could sense her hesitation. Rules, liability, the unspoken belief that Daniel Harris was still the man who'd failed in Yellowstone. Finally, she agreed to help, on the condition he would update her daily. The supplies would come on the mail truck from Kalispell in 2 days. Wound dressings, antibiotics, syringes for feeding. Until then, it was up to Daniel, his memories, and a will he thought he'd lost. Those 2 days stretched. Ash drifted in and out of consciousness, too weak to fight, but not ready to die. Daniel crushed aspirin into powder, stirred it into a drop of warm water, and trickled it between the kitten's teeth with a dropper. He stitched the leg as best he could, hands shaking, praying he remembered the right knots from long-ago fieldwork. Blood welled, dark and sticky, but the stitches held. He rigged a heat lamp from an old lantern, and a metal reflector scavenged from the shed. The glow filled the cabin with a tired yellow light, casting shadows that seemed to flicker with Ash's heartbeat. Each hour, Daniel measured out formula, coaxed it down with patience. Sometimes the kitten spat it out. Sometimes, in the gray lull before dawn, Ash would fix Daniel with those wild eyes, suspicious, but unwilling to let go. One night, a fox approached the cabin, drawn by the scent of blood. Daniel heard the low growl outside the window and stepped onto the porch, shotgun in hand. He fired into the air, the echo snapping against the hills. The fox slunk away, but the image stayed with him. A world where everything hunted and nothing was ever truly safe. Sleep became a luxury. Daniel set his alarm for every 2 hours, rising to check Ash's breathing, adjust the heat, clean the wound. He muttered encouragement, half for the kitten, half for himself. "You're tougher than you look. You're a Montana cat, aren't you?" The mail truck, battered red and streaked with ice, finally rattled down the lane. Daniel signed for the supplies, thanked the driver, and hurried inside. "Dr. Palm," Lindstrom called that evening. Her voice was softer this time. "If he makes it through the week, you'll have done better than most. Remember, no matter what, don't let him get too comfortable with humans. If you do, he'll never survive the wild." Daniel listened, the responsibility settling on him like a second winter. But he'd already made the choice. The world had taken enough from him. He wouldn't let it take Ash, too. That night, as he sat by the fire, Ash curled against his side, not out of trust, but out of exhaustion. Daniel ran his hand gently over the kitten's ribs, feeling each bone, every shiver. "I don't know if I can fix what's broken," he whispered, "but I'll give you a fighting chance." Outside, snow began to fall again, thick and relentless, erasing the world beyond the windows. Inside, the old cabin pulsed with 2 fragile heartbeats, both refusing to give up. Daniel realized then, it wasn't about redemption or making up for past mistakes. It was about saving one small life, even when the world said it wasn't worth the trouble. And in that stubborn act of hope, Daniel felt the first crack of light slip through his darkness. The worst of winter eased its grip, but in Montana that only meant the storms came less often, never that they were truly over. Daniel watched from his porch as the Flathead River carved slow blue channels through the ice, the forests bristling green beneath crusts of snow. By now, Ash had survived wounds that should have killed him. He'd grown stronger, leaner, his fur shining in the pale sunlight that filtered through Daniel's frosted windows. But survival inside a cabin wasn't life for a bobcat. Daniel knew that. Instinct kept whispering it every time Ash pressed his nose to the glass, watching a raven swoop down to tear at something in the snow. Sometimes, in the hush before sunrise, Daniel could almost sense the restlessness in the air, a wild thing waiting to remember who it was. He started journaling again, at first just out of habit, filling pages with observations about Ash, how his tail flicked when the wind changed, how he crouched low and still when mice rustled in the walls. But soon the notes changed, became less about data, more about wonder. "Ash is learning to stalk in silence," he wrote. "He's patient, almost regal. I think he's teaching me more about myself than any animal I've ever known." Daniel reached out to Dr. Lindstrom at the Bozeman Center, proposing a plan few dared attempt: rewilding a hand-raised bobcat. Most experts discouraged it. Too dangerous. He could imprint on you, lose his edge, or he might never trust humans again. But Daniel insisted. "If I wanted a pet, I would have gotten a cat from Missoula shelter. This one belongs to Montana." The plan was simple, but every step mattered. He built an outdoor pen from old fencing and scrap wood, making sure Ash felt the wind, smelled the world. He scattered bits of venison and raw chicken around the pen, sometimes hiding them beneath snow or leaves. At first, Ash prowled clumsily, more curious than cunning. But each day, the kitten grew bolder, pouncing at shadows, vanishing behind driftwood, eyes glittering with ancient memory. Daniel added challenges. He strung feathered toys from the lowest branches of a ponderosa pine. He buried frozen squirrels near the pen's edge, letting Ash dig them out, paws caked with earth. He even built makeshift snow dens, teaching the young bobcat to hollow out the cold and wait, silent and unseen. The wild, it turned out, was still in Ash's blood. The process wasn't easy. There were setbacks, nights when Ash tried to escape, raking claws against the wire, wild with confusion and fear. Once, Daniel found the pen empty, his stomach sinking as he raced into the trees. He tracked tiny paw prints to the riverbank, only to spot Ash crouched under a fallen log, watching a kingfisher dart for minnows. Daniel waited, heart pounding, until Ash finally circled back, tail high with pride and defiance. These close calls reminded Daniel of the risks, how easily a wild thing could be lost, how much was beyond his control. But each return felt like a promise. Ash wasn't meant to be caged, but he wasn't ready to be lost either. Daniel's journal became a record not just of animal progress, but of transformation, his and Ash's. He found himself sketching the bobcat at dusk, writing down little victories. Today he climbed the pine to the second branch. He watched a fox in the meadow and didn't flinch. With every entry, Daniel felt less like a failure, more like a witness to something ancient and good. He kept in touch with the rehab center, sending photos and updates. Once, a local reporter heard of his work and called for an interview, hoping for a human interest piece about second chances. Daniel turned her down. This was never about publicity. It was about giving one wild creature the freedom he'd lost in himself. And still, every night as the sun faded over the bitterroots and the wind rattled the cabin door, Daniel would whisper to the dark, "I hope I'm doing right by you. I hope you'll remember this. How to survive, how to trust the wild, how to let go." One morning, as Ash leapt from the pen and vanished into the snowy brush, Daniel felt both terror and hope in equal measure. The wild doesn't give out guarantees, but sometimes it offers a second chance. Spring arrived late that year, the snow giving way to muddy trails and sharp shoots of green along the banks of the Flathead River. Daniel should have felt hope. The world outside was waking, but inside his body, something else was shutting down. It began with headaches, dull at first, then sudden spikes like lightning across his skull. Sometimes he'd forget what he was doing, standing in the middle of the yard, as if he'd lost the thread of his own life. His vision blurred in the mornings, and his hands, steady through storms and stitches, started to tremble. He tried to ignore it, blaming the fatigue on long nights and the demands of caring for a half-wild animal. But Ash was thriving. The bobcat moved with strength now, darting through the brush, stalking birds and mice with a confidence that belonged to the mountains. Daniel watched with pride, but also a growing dread. What if he wasn't around to finish what he'd started? It was a neighbor, old Mrs. Carter, who found him collapsed on the porch one gray morning, coffee spilled at his feet, Ash circling anxiously nearby. She bundled him into her pickup and drove him to the hospital in Missoula, ignoring his half-hearted protests. The ER was sterile, buzzing with fluorescent lights and the sharp scent of antiseptic, a world away from the wild comfort of Daniel's cabin. He lay on a thin mattress, listening to the quiet beeps of a monitor, trying to map his thoughts through the fog. The diagnosis came quickly. Terminal brain cancer. The doctors spoke gently, but with finality, offering treatment options, outlining aggressive therapies. Weeks, maybe months, traded for time in windowless rooms. Daniel stared at the ceiling, his mind already wandering back to the sound of wind in the pines. He declined the treatments. "If I have only a little time left," he told the oncologist, "I'd rather spend it with the mountains of Montana than in a cold chemo ward." Word spread quickly through the small community. Daniel was the subject of whispered conversations at the Kalispell Pharmacy, the topic of hushed prayers at the Whitefish Church. A few neighbors dropped off casseroles or split firewood for his cabin, but Daniel found himself pulling away from everyone, except Ash. Back home, Daniel moved slower. He stumbled sometimes, dropping tools or forgetting the name of a wildflower he'd known since childhood. Ash sensed the change, growing more protective, always hovering near the door when Daniel ventured outside. But Daniel pushed himself, determined not to waste the time he had left. He journaled every day, documenting not just Ash's progress, but also his own fears, his regrets, his hope that something of himself would endure through the Bobcat. At night, as the sky blazed with stars over the bitterroots, Daniel would lie awake listening to Ash's soft movements by the fire. He'd reach out, feeling the steady thrum of life beside him, and let the quiet settle his heart. There was a bittersweet clarity to it all, a sense that every day was precious, even in its pain. Daniel wasn't ready to say goodbye, but he could no longer pretend the future was wide and open. And still, as the world spun on, Daniel clung to a simple, stubborn truth. If you give your love to the wild, sometimes it gives back in ways you never expected. If this moment moved you, tell me, have you ever faced something you couldn't control? And how did you find the courage to keep going? Drop a comment below. And if you want to follow the rest of Daniel and Ash's journey, hit like and subscribe. Your support means more than you know. Montana's summer arrived with sudden violence. Storms rolling over the Bitterroots, rivers swelling with snowmelt, and wildflowers erupting along every rocky slope. Daniel felt each day slip through his fingers faster than the last, measured not by hours, but by how much strength he could wring from his weakening body. He poured himself into Ash's training, refusing to let the Bobcat see fear or weakness. Their lessons shifted outside the pen and into the tangled woods, where danger lurked with every step. Coyotes crying in the dusk, hawks circling overhead, and the ever-present whisper of wolves deeper in the valley. Daniel knew the wild would show no mercy, not even for a cat who'd once called a man home. Each morning, Daniel led Ash along the banks of the Flathead, pointing out the tracks of deer, raccoon, and the sharp, clean scent of grizzlies that sometimes lingered in the damp air. He made a ritual of walking the same trails his father had taught him, showing Ash how to recognize the markers of old Bobcat territories, where to scent mark, where to avoid. He pushed Ash harder than before, tossing raw game into the brush and forcing the young cat to hunt, stalk, wait. There were failures, missed leaps, lost prey, days when Ash would sulk, sullen and confused by Daniel's boots. But the triumphs, when they came, were exhilarating. Ash ambushing a ground squirrel, scaling a ponderosa for hours, vanishing and reappearing with fur dusted in sap and pride. Daniel's journal became a map of their progress, every page etched with hope and grief. Ash learned to avoid the East Stream, wolves there last night. He stood his ground when a fox crept too close. I think he's ready. I have to be ready too. Yet, the world outside was always a threat. One afternoon, as Daniel struggled up a steep rise, He heard the unmistakable grunt of a grizzly not 50 yards away. He froze, motioning Ash to drop low. The wind shifted, carrying their scent, and the bear crashed through the brush, vanishing into the green. It was a reminder. The wild would not forgive mistakes. Daniel's hands shook as he pressed his palm to Ash's sitad. You see? Out here, fear keeps you alive. Nights grew harder. Daniel's headaches left him dizzy, and sometimes he'd wake in the grass, not remembering how he'd gotten there. Ash would curl beside him, eyes wide and watchful, the line between teped and predator blurring with every shared breath. He began pulling away from people, canceling check-ins with Dr. Lindstrom and the rehab center, even letting phone calls go unanswered. Everything he had left was for Ash. Friends from Kalispell tried to visit, but Daniel made excuses. There was too much left to teach, too little time to waste on farewells. One evening, as fireflies danced above the wild meadow and the air shimmered with the promise of a coming storm, Daniel sat by the fading fire, Ash at his feet. He spoke aloud, voice thick. You're more than a bobcat now. You're Montana's child. You belong to these woods, not to me. For a long time, Ash just watched him, silent, inscrutable, the wild burning in his gaze. Daniel reached out, fingers brushing the soft fur behind the ears. Someday, you'll leave, and I'll have to let you go. He understood, finally, that preparing Ash for freedom was as much about letting go as it was about teaching him to survive. He could give the bobcat tools, instincts, the shape of old dangers, but not safety, not certainty. That was never the promise of the wild. In the dark, with only the sound of crickets and the distant rush of the river, Daniel felt the full weight of both love and loss, knowing that the bravest thing he could do now was set the wildest thing he loved free. By late summer, Daniel's world had narrowed to a handful of hours each day, brief windows of clarity breaking through the fog of headaches and exhaustion. He spent those moments by the window of his small cabin, watching sunlight flicker through the pines. Ash curled up nearby in the patch of warmth on the floor. Even as Daniel's body failed him, his heart held fast to the rhythms of Montana. The shrill calls of ospreys overhead, the hush of wind over the Flathead River, the soft thump of Ash's paws on the wooden boards. But the day came when Daniel could no longer walk without stumbling, when even holding a pen felt like trying to write with someone else's hand. A neighbor found him collapsed beside the porch, lips blue, breathing shallow. There was no argument this time. He was taken to the hospital in Whitefish, a small, wood-framed building on the edge of town, its windows looking out toward the distant peaks. The hospital felt like another exile. White walls, antiseptic air, the steady drone of machines. Daniel's room was bright but empty, a vase of wildflowers fading on the nightstand. He drifted in and out of sleep, sometimes waking confused, sometimes lucid enough to ache for home. Through it all, he clung to memories of the wild, Ash's silent leaps, the scent of rain on pine needles, his father's laughter echoing across Flathead Lake. Word spread quickly to the rehab center in Bozeman. Dr. Lindstrom, remembering Daniel's devotion and the story of the bobcat that refused to die, made calls, first to the hospital board, then to animal control, finally to the Montana Fish and Wildlife Office. It's a special case, she argued. The bond they share isn't just emotional. For Daniel, that animal is hope itself. After days of petitions and paperwork, an exception was made. Ash could visit, as an end-of-life therapy animal, if escorted by veterinary staff and handlers. On a golden afternoon, Ash arrived in a sturdy carrier, eyes wary, fur bristling at the unfamiliar smells and sounds. A young vet whispered comfort through the bars as they wheeled the carrier into Daniel's room. The moment Ash was let out, the hospital seemed to change. The nurses, hard-bitten, used to sorrow, fell silent as the bobcat padded softly across the linoleum, nose twitching. Ash paused at the foot of Daniel's bed, as if measuring the distance between two worlds, wild and tame, life and death. Then, with deliberate grace, he leapt onto the bed, settling beside Daniel's chest. Daniel's eyes opened, clear and bright for the first time in days. He lifted a trembling hand and touched the bobcat's head, fingers threading through familiar fur. For a moment, there were no wires, no beeping monitors, just the soft rumble of Ash's purr, the weight of a life shared. "I knew you'd come," Daniel whispered, the words barely more than breath. He closed his eyes, the lines in his face softening, his body relaxing into the mattress. Ash pressed his head against Daniel's chest, purring with a deep, rhythmic sound that seemed to fill the room with warmth. The nurses watched from the doorway, some wiping away tears, others quietly crossing themselves. The vet who'd brought Ash stood back, hand on the doorframe, sensing that some threshold had been crossed, not just between man and animal, but between holding on and letting go. When the sun slipped behind the mountains, Daniel's breathing slowed. The room grew quiet, the shadows lengthened, and as the last light faded from the sky, Daniel smiled one last time, lips moving in a wordless goodbye. Ash remained beside him, a silent witness, as night claimed the valley and the first cool wind of autumn brushed against the glass. Daniel's passing was as gentle as dusk rolling over the Cabinet Mountains, a life slipping quietly from one world into the next. The hospital room lingered in a hush even after the machines fell silent. The only sound, the soft, steady purr of Ash pressed close against Daniel's heart. Outside, the first leaves of autumn whispered through the parking lot, brushing gold and russet against the windows. The news moved through the community like wind through tall grass. Daniel Harris, once an exile, now mourned as a neighbor, a friend, a man who'd given all he had for a wild thing. The staff at the Bozeman Rehab Center took charge of Ash, their movements gentle but purposeful. There was no talk of zoos or cages. Daniel's wishes were clear, written in bold, uneven script across his final journal entries. He belongs to Montana. Let him be wild. A few days later, beneath a sky scraped clean by mountain winds, a small group gathered at the edge of the Cabinet Mountains, far from highways and fences. There were no speeches, only the solemn work of opening Ash's carrier and stepping back. For a moment, the bobcat hesitated, muscles tensed, nose flaring with the sense of home and history. Then, in a blur of tawny fur and silent confidence, Ash bounded into the underbrush. He paused once halfway up a rise dappled with chokecherry and fallen needles, glancing back at the group with those wild gold eyes. It felt almost like goodbye, almost like forgiveness. For weeks, there were occasional glimpses, tracks in the snow near an old trapper's cabin, a shadow moving between rocks at dawn, the startled cry of a raven scattering into the pines. Locals left scraps of meat at the tree line, not out of pity, but out of a quiet respect. Ash became legend, a whispered presence along the ridges and in the stories traded over black coffee at the diner in Libby or by the firesides in Kalispell. Life, Daniel had always believed, didn't end so much as it changed its shape. Ash had carried a part of him into the deep woods, a stubborn kindness, a lesson in loyalty that would ripple through the wild long after footprints faded. There were days when hikers would find a tuft of spotted fur caught on a thorn, or see paw prints skirting a frozen creek. And sometimes, just before the world tipped into darkness, they swore they heard a low, familiar purr somewhere in the timber, steady and warm as a promise. Back at the cabin, Daniel's journals and field notes remained. A record not just of survival, but of transformation, of the wild weaving itself into the human heart and leaving both forever changed. Montana's nights grew colder, the mountains edged with snow once again. But the story of Daniel and Ash lingered, etched into the landscape, carried on the wind. Have you ever had to let go of something you love, trusting it would find its own way? Share your story below, your moments of farewell, of courage, of wild hope. And if you want more journeys like this, hit like and subscribe. Your voice and your heart matter here. Autumn deepened across Montana, the Cabinet Mountains cast in long blue shadows, snow dusting the highest ridges even as aspen leaves flickered gold. Life in the valley moved on. Trucks rattled down gravel roads, smoke curled from cabin chimneys, the cycle of seasons indifferent to loss. Yet something subtle had changed, a sense of quiet reverence lingering in the woods and in the small towns strung along the highway. After Daniel's funeral, a simple gathering by the Flathead, with old friends and a handful of conservationists from Bozeman, the rehab center sent a box to the Montana Conservation Center in Helena. Inside were Daniel's journals, battered, ink-stained, thick with field notes and scribbled reflections, sketches of bobcat prints, and pages full of longing and hope. A young biologist named Will McAdams, who'd once studied under Daniel, was the first to open them. He stayed up late, reading by lamplight, stunned by the blend of raw science and aching humanity. Daniel hadn't just recorded Ash's rewilding. He'd captured the pulse of Montana itself, the scent of spruce after rain, the sound of a bobcat's heartbeat under a hand trembling with chemo, the weight of love measured in risk and letting go. Moved by what he read, Will worked with the Conservation Center to publish selections of the journals. They were raw and unpolished, honest about Daniel's failures and doubts as much as his triumphs. When the first copies arrived, they made their way into local libraries, schools, ranger outposts, and even to the shelf of the town diner. The journals became a quiet sensation. People lingered over the worn pages, reading Daniel's story aloud to children, debating his choices over coffee, or just sitting by the window, book in hand, watching snow gather on the sills. Soon, the story reached further. A journalist from the Missoula Gazette ran a feature on the man who gave Montana its bobcat back, sparking letters to the editor and talk show discussions about conservation, loss, and the meaning of compassion. Hunters and hikers alike debated the ethics of rewilding, some skeptical, others inspired, but none unmoved. That winter, the Montana State University hosted a conference on human-wildlife bonds, with Daniel's journals as the centerpiece. Scientists presented new studies on reintroduction and habitat restoration, but it was Daniel's voice, humble and reflective, that lingered in the air. When Will read a passage about the night Ash curled against Daniel's chest in the hospital, the auditorium fell silent. Even the seasoned field biologists wiped at their eyes. Daniel's reputation, once shadowed by the failure at Yellowstone, transformed. His story became not just one of redemption, but of courage to care, publicly and without certainty, for a life others might overlook. Teachers in rural schools used the tale to teach children about Montana's ecosystems, but also about resilience and the necessity of hope. Local papers in Missoula, Kalispell, and Helena kept the story alive, updating readers when a bobcat was spotted near an old cabin, or when someone found Daniel's initials, carved long ago in a cedar by the flathead. He became, quietly and posthumously, a symbol of how one broken person can repair not just an animal, but the thread that binds people to the wild. Through it all, Ash's legend grew, a presence glimpsed at dawn, a paw print on the snow, a living memory stalking the ridges of Montana. And in every retelling, the line between myth and truth blurred, until both were equally powerful. Daniel was gone, but his gift, to Ash, to the wild, and to the hearts of those who listened, remained, as real as the mountains themselves. Some stories end in a blaze of revelation, but this one fades like the Montana dusk, soft, steady, and a little unresolved. Daniel's journey with Ash was never about easy answers, never about a hero triumphing over nature or erasing all loss. Instead, it was about two wounded creatures, one man, one bobcat, teaching each other how to live and then how to let go. In the months and years that followed, Ash's shadow became a part of the landscape, slipping between lodgepoles at dawn or vanishing in the fog near the riverbanks. Hikers still swapped stories, sometimes certain they'd glimpsed the bobcat just ahead, sometimes wondering if the paw prints they found in the fresh snow were his or belonged to the endless, untamed wild that always outlasts us. But the truth is, what Daniel gave to Ash was never meant to be owned. It was a kind of trust, a release to that few people dare to offer the things they love. The journals that Daniel left behind were more than just field notes or confessionals. They became a blueprint for compassion in a world that too often tells us to turn away. This isn't just about saving a bobcat, one teacher in Kalispell wrote in the margin of her copy. It's about being brave enough to care, even when no one else is watching. Parents read Daniel's words to their children before bed, and park rangers found themselves quoting his advice as they guided tourists through the high valleys. Even the gruff old-timers at the diner found comfort in the story, a reassurance that what's broken can still matter, that even after public failure and heartbreak, the act of kindness is never wasted. For some, the story was about redemption. For others, it was a meditation on grief, on the way we all carry scars invisible as the trails that crisscross the Bitterroot. But maybe, at its heart, it was always about connection. How the wild inside us answers to the wild outside. How love, given freely, without expectation, somehow circles back, healing places we thought would always hurt. Daniel Harris was gone, but those who hiked the Cabinet Mountains sometimes claimed to feel a presence in the quiet, a sense of being watched over, accompanied, encouraged to keep going just a little farther. And every so often, someone would return from a lonely stretch of forest, swear they'd heard a purr rolling out of the twilight, as if Ash too was still keeping watch. This is not a story of neat endings, It's a reminder that we are all, each of us, a little wild, a little wounded, and a little braver than we know when it comes time to say goodbye. So if you're reading this, maybe you're holding your own story close, a hope, a regret, a memory that aches when the seasons turn. Maybe you too have loved something or someone wild and had to let go. If this story touched you, I hope you'll hold your loved ones a little closer tonight. Human or animal, wild or tamed. Share your own memories, your farewells, your moments of holding on and letting go. Let the legacy of Daniel and Ash remind you. Compassion, once given, always finds its way home. And if you want to journey further into stories of courage, heartbreak, and the wild heart of Montana, don't forget to leave a comment, like, and subscribe. After all, every voice adds to the chorus. Every story matters.